in the interest of time, I'm going to let our last speaker, Dr. Pearman, last but certainly not least speaker, Dr. Pearman, jump on and talk about how do I cope with a melanoma diagnosis. And this is really something I think we can all learn from. And then again, if you have questions, I'm going to ask all of our panelists to check in on the Q&A section and try to answer those while we're hearing Tim's talk, and then we'll probably wrap it up right after that. So thanks everyone for hanging on.
Well, thank you everybody. I appreciate everybody hanging on until the bitter end. You guys are champions. Let me see if I can share my screen. All right, so we've heard a lot tonight about how to manage your physical health, and I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about how we can manage our emotional or psychological health. And I you know, this title, I feel like speaks to what we're all experiencing, like political unrest, COVID, all of this stuff. On top of that, if you're diagnosed with melanoma or cancer, how do you kind of manage all of the stressors that you have in your life? And I think this is one message that everyone who is diagnosed with cancer gets bombarded with. So think positive. You've got to keep your attitude positive. Don't get depressed. You're a survivor. You're a fighter. I would like to argue for just a few minutes that that's not realistic. None of us can stay uniformly positive throughout this experience. And as a clinical psychologist, I would say, I think it's really psychologically healthy to have some really painful feelings, to be depressed at times, to be anxious about the future, and also potentially to have feelings like gratitude that a diagnosis of melanoma or cancer can bring about. So I think this is a really complicated picture, and I just want everybody to realize that it's not necessarily realistic to feel like you have to be positive all of the time. So how do we typically cope when we have a diagnosis of cancer or when we have a stressor in our lives? And typically, most of us respond with sort of a problem-solving attitude. And this is generally very adaptive. It works pretty well, but this approach focuses on dealing with identifying what the cause of a given problem is, and then how do we reduce or eliminate that source of stress. But the problem with this in the current state of affairs is that this strategy is most effective when the stressors are controllable. And obviously, in the time of COVID, with all the political unrest, and also a lot of the things that we cope with when we're diagnosed with cancer, a lot of the stressors that we have are not necessarily controllable. And so I think it begs the question of what can we do differently? Like, how can we actually cope better with some of these uncontrollable stressors? And I'll talk for just a few minutes about sort of some of the ways that we can do this. And I think if there's one thing to take away from tonight in terms of like psychological and emotional health, it's that I think the more that we can focus on the parts of our lives that are controllable and push to the side the parts that are not controllable, the better off our emotional or psychological health will be. And that's not to say that we're in denial or that we don't realize that the uncontrollable things are stressful. It's just that we're spending most of our time and energy on the potentially controllable things. So the first thing is physical activity, exercise. If you go to the internet, if you go to PubMed and type in exercise and cancer, you will find literally thousands of studies that have looked at the impact of exercise on outcomes in cancer. And almost to a study, exercise has been found to be very beneficial for cancer survivors. It also doesn't seem to matter what kind of exercise you do. A lot of the studies have been done on things that you would expect, like moderate intensity walking, yoga, those kinds of things. But if you really dig into the research, they've looked at things like kickboxing, Zumba, working out at home with a Wii Fit. So all of those like different modalities of exercise have been found to be pretty beneficial. And if there's any sort of one size fits all treatment for a lot of the things that cancer survivors go through when they're in treatment, it's exercise. So it helps with cancer-related fatigue. It helps with insomnia. It helps with depression. It helps with anxiety. It helps with appetite. It helps with weight. So I can't push physical activity enough. The second thing is nutrition. So nutrition obviously is really important for anyone, but especially when you've been diagnosed with cancer and are going through cancer treatment. And I think it's also really important to know that you don't need to be an expert in nutrition. These are the guidelines from the American Cancer Society, but I will say that I think they're a little bit vague. If you come from a family like mine, where I have two very Southern parents, and my wife, who's a vegetarian, jokes sometimes that when we go home to see my family, we can go an entire weekend without having one meal that does not involve bacon or red meat. So if you come from a family like mine, this second bullet point, limiting the amounts of processed meats and red meat, might mean we're just going to have 2 meals today with red meat instead of 3. And that's not really what we're talking about. So I think it's really important for anyone who's been diagnosed with cancer to avail yourself of all of the available resources that you have in terms of nutrition. So ask your doctors, ask your nurses for a referral to a dietitian, and have someone who's actually an expert in this help you with your diet and your intake. The third thing is just stress reduction. And this obviously means different things to different people, but I think overall, this just means engaging in activities that you find meaningful, enjoyable, things that make you laugh, scheduling social activities, but obviously social activities can be really tricky during the time of COVID. So it also can make you think of other things that are a little bit more like self-focused. So things like writing in a journal, doing art projects, practicing relaxation techniques like meditation, guided imagery, breathing exercises. And I would also say that we work really closely at Northwestern with a lot of community partners. So Wellness House, Gilda's Club, Living Well if you're in the western suburbs. These are all cancer support communities that you can get involved with. All of them have their activities online in the time of COVID, and it's all free of charge. So definitely, again, avail yourself of the resources that are available for stress reduction. And the final thing I just want to talk for a minute about is mindfulness. So I think mindfulness has become sort of a buzzword. Everybody should be mindful and all of that, but it's difficult to know exactly what that means. This is one definition of mindfulness, but I think this graphic is actually a little bit more helpful to me in terms of knowing what mindfulness means. So for any of you who have a dog, you may relate to this. So when you're taking your dog for a walk in the park, it's really easy to be distracted by when do I need to pick the kids up from school and what's on my calendar for tomorrow and what stressful events have happened today and all of those kinds of things. Whereas your dog, at least as far as we can tell, is focused on, wow, I'm running around on grass and there are trees here and there's a beautiful sun. So I think that's really kind of what we're trying to do, is to become more like our canine friends. And there are a number of techniques that I don't have enough time to go into today, but in general, being present should be the focus of this. So it's really important to pay attention to your breath. Notice if your breathing is really shallow, or if you're able to fully inflate your lungs and breathe deeply. It's also really important to just kind of scan your body and see how your body's feeling. So a lot of times when we're stressed, we'll notice that our shoulders will come up like this and our neck may hurt, we may have a headache. So it's important to just kind of scan your body, notice any tension that you have, And then to just pay attention to that without judgment and see if we can turn that around if we're feeling really stressed. So I'm sorry that I've run through this really quickly, but in the interest of time, I just want to say it's really important for anyone who's been diagnosed with melanoma to sort of just understand and give yourself the appreciation that there are going to be complicated feelings. You're not going to be able to feel positive all the time, and to be a little bit compassionate with yourself when you're not feeling as positive, when you may be having a down day or maybe feeling worried about the future. And then that can kind of help us to identify what are our values and figure out what are some activities that we can do to create meaning in our lives. Also, I would say, again, be aware and avail yourself of the resources in your community with the cancer support resources that are out there. And please reach out to any of your physicians, nurses, if you need more help. I think everybody's going to have access to this slide deck, but I included this last slide just so everybody can have some online tools if you want to look into this in a deeper way.